All right, to Paris now, where European leaders held an emergency meeting today to discuss next steps to help end the war in Ukraine. The meeting came together Monday after the Trump administration said they would not be included, Ukraine would not be, in talks with Russia to end the conflict. Now, the leaders of Germany, the UK, Italy, Poland, Spain, the Netherlands, also Denmark, and the European Union did meet at Paris's Élysée Palace. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was also there, and the consensus is that Europe must be part of the process, and the U.S. must also commit to the security of Europe.
Europe must play its role, and I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
Joining me now to talk more about this is Peter MacKay. He was Defence Minister under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and Kerry Buck, who is Canada's former ambassador to NATO. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Ms. Buck, I want to start with you. After hearing from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer there, how do you feel about European unity, which you have said could be tested in the face of where the Trump administration is now moving?
The problem is we don't know where the Trump administration is moving. It's not clear what their plan is, including to senior members of the Trump administration. And it's certainly not clear yet what Russia's going to ask in return, what they're going to demand in return. So it's hard. European unity may get tested further down the line when something is more clear. But I think it's pretty clear that the European leaders are united on the need to have Europe engaged in the peace talks, and obviously Ukraine engaged in the peace talks. And the U.S. hasn't been clear on that. There have been mixed messages coming out of senior leaders of the U.S. administration. So it's a real challenge.
Yeah, and Mr. MacKay, just ahead of those talks in Saudi Arabia, I mean, to Ms. Buck's point, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has said that Ukraine should abandon hopes of returning to its pre-2014 borders. How worried are you about those types of comments on the eve of that important meeting?
I'm very worried, and I think these sort of inconsistent messages from Hegseth, and I think we're going to find out shortly what Marco Rubio, the Foreign Secretary, has to say, is very unsettling. It's certainly unsettling for European leaders, for the Commission of the European Union. We heard from the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, basically saying we're now prepared to consider putting British boots on the ground. That's something we've not heard before. But essentially putting it back in the Americans' court, saying we want the U.S. to backstop any sort of peace negotiation that would involve having troops inside borders of Ukraine and Russia. And so there is a lot of moving parts here. The meeting that the U.S. is planning to host in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, also is happening to the exclusion of Ukraine and the Europeans. So this is causing confusion. This is causing alarm, certainly for Vladimir Zelensky, who is saying we have to be in the mix here for any decision to be taken, and we won't accept it otherwise.
Ms. Buck, how do you feel about what you heard from the G7 foreign ministers? And I know that Mr. MacKay just mentioned Marco Rubio. He was part of that meeting on the margins of the Munich Securities Conference. And it was in Canada's, under Canada's first 2025 presidency. As we know, we take over the G7. But in that joint statement, I'll read from it here. It says the G7 members reaffirmed their unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. How important in your mind is that statement, especially this week?
Well, I think it was the bright light over the weekend, to be honest, when you compare it to some of the pronouncements from the White House and from Secretary of Defense and other members of the Trump administration. It was the most positive, unified, and strongest statement of support for Ukraine. But the problem is that then we have to juxtapose this against other facts and other statements. The fact, as Peter MacKay said, that the Ukrainians aren't involved yet, that's not great. It's manifestly bad. There's been some hint there'll be a sequencing of talks. The other fact, or the words that really, really matter right now, is that the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, already went out publicly and said what the U.S. is willing to give up in talks. Not what Ukraine has agreed to give up, not what the Europeans are ready to back, but what the U.S. is ready to give up in talks. And that includes, as you said, saying it's unrealistic that Ukraine can actually maintain its territorial integrity, that they'll have to give up something. Maybe Crimea, maybe more, who knows? They've also come out, Pete Hegseth also came out and said that Ukraine's membership in NATO is off the table. And he also said the possibility of a U.S. presence in Ukraine to enforce those post-war security guarantees, so the backstop that Starmer spoke about, that's off the table. For me, that's a really odd way to begin negotiations, saying what you're ready to give up at the beginning, possibly in an effort to get, the Russians to the table, but he's giving Vladimir Putin everything that Vladimir Putin wants, Trump is. So very bad news for Ukraine if it keeps going in this direction.
Mr. McKay, what does this do for Canada and our place in NATO right now? Because you consider how the U.S. is seeing not only defense on this continent, but across the world as well, and members of the alliance. So what role could Canada play in all of this now?
Well, firstly, just to come back quickly to the point of this bilateral discussion that's happening between Russia and the United States, that has everyone, Canadians alike, quite concerned. What we can do in terms of any sort of future discussion around having people promote and protect citizens as part of some form of the negotiated peace. And let's never forget that unless a war is won outright, which very rarely happens, there is a negotiation. But Kerry's right. If we, the United States, on behalf of Western allies, are putting all the cards on the table now, that's not really a coherent way to go into a negotiation. It's also worth mentioning that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths of soldiers and civilians in this conflict. That's now going to be it'll enter its fourth year on February 24th. So there's a sense of urgency. We see an accelerated focus on trying to bring this conflict, this war, this illegal invasion of Ukraine to an end. But it seems incoherent at this stage, which is troubling. And for Canada, we have lost. We have to be quite certain that we have lost a lot of respect in the eyes of the world because we haven't kept up our 2% spending. We have not shown up at NATO with strength in recent years. We've been struggling to get to what is now being outlined by the Secretary General of NATO as a 3% floor. So we have a lot of work to do on the home front before we're able to really play a traditional role for Canada of strength in both negotiations and in some sort of a role in a conflict, God forbid that we're there again.
Yeah, okay. We're going to have to leave it there. Peter MacKay, former Minister of Defense under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, and Kerry Buck, Canada's former ambassador to NATO. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.